The first sign that my marriage was over was not the divorce papers, or the raised voice, or even the way my husband stopped looking at me like a person. It was the smile he wore when he said my name, slow and careful, like he had already practiced this moment in his head, and was pleased with how it would land. That was when I knew something had shifted permanently. That smile was not regret. It was relief. My name is Alara Whitcomb, and for 17 years I built a life so quietly that the man standing across from me eventually convinced himself it had built itself. We met when we were young enough to confuse potential with character. He was charming, ambitious, endlessly certain of his own brilliance. I was practical, organized, and patient in ways that do not photograph well. While he learned how to sell himself in rooms full of people, I learned how to make sure the lights stayed on. I handled the schedules, the bills, the paperwork, the things that never earn applause but keep everything from collapsing. He stood at the front. I held the frame together from behind. Over time, the story became familiar to everyone but me. He was the provider. He was the visionary. I was lucky. That was the version repeated at dinners, at parties, at holidays with his family. I smiled and let it stand because correcting people takes energy, and I was already using mine to keep our life functional. The day he decided I was done, he did not sit me down gently. He did not circle the subject or pretend this was difficult. He waited until a weekday afternoon when he knew I would be home, stood in the doorway of the kitchen, and told me he wanted a divorce the way someone announces a scheduling change. He said it was not working anymore. He said he needed a clean break. He said this was best for both of us. Then he told me what he was taking: the house, the cars, the savings, the business interests. Everything we had built together would stay with him. He said this calmly, confidently, as if he were listing items already packed. He framed it as fairness. He had earned it after all. He had taken the risks. He had carried the weight. I could start over. I was adaptable. He said that word like it was a compliment. I remember nodding while something inside me went very still. People love to believe betrayal is loud, that it arrives with shouting and tears and broken objects. But real betrayal is efficient. It assumes compliance. It moves quickly so you do not have time to ask the wrong questions. The reactions came immediately. Friends called in panic. His sister told me to fight. My mother asked what I had done to make him unhappy. Everyone had advice, and all of it was urgent. I was passed phone numbers for lawyers and therapists and accountants like I was hemorrhaging and they were throwing towels. I hired a lawyer because that was expected of me. He was competent and visibly alarmed. He told me the division was grossly unfair. He told me I had rights. He told me we could contest everything. He leaned forward across his desk and asked if I understood what I was about to lose. I told him I understood. What I did not tell him was why I was not afraid. From the outside, it looked like I was folding. I did not argue with my husband. I did not cry in front of him. I did not threaten or negotiate. I asked clarifying questions and took notes. I listened while he explained how reasonable he was being, how generous even, how this would allow us both to move on quickly. He mistook my quiet for defeat. That assumption settled over the room like a heavy curtain, hiding everything behind it. I let him believe the story he wanted. I let everyone believe it. Because sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is let someone think you have nothing left. I signed nothing that day. I agreed to nothing out loud. I went home, closed the door, and sat in silence long enough to hear my own breathing again. On the surface, my life looked like it was unraveling. Underneath, something precise and patient had already begun, and he had no idea. They did not wait long to apply pressure. Once my husband realized I was not shouting or threatening, he assumed I was pliable, and everyone else followed his lead. The calls started first. His family called to remind me how much he had done for me. My family called to ask why I was not angrier. Friends called with urgency in their voices, telling me I needed to fight before it was too late. Everyone spoke as if panic were proof of intelligence. The legal pressure came next. Documents arrived in neat envelopes that carried an unspoken message: sign now or suffer later. Each page was written in language designed to intimidate, heavy with consequences and deadlines. My lawyer called after every delivery, his tone sharpening with concern. He warned me about leverage. He warned me about precedent. He warned me about what happens when one party appears too agreeable in a divorce. I listened carefully and thanked him for his concern. That seemed to disturb him more than anger would have. He asked me more than once if I was in shock. He asked if I was sleeping. He asked if I wanted to talk to someone. I let him believe I was barely holding it together. I sighed at the right moments. I admitted to feeling tired. I told him I did not know how much fight I had left. None of that was a lie, exactly. Exhaustion does not exclude clarity. Sometimes it sharpens it. My husband mistook my stillness for fear. He began to push harder. He requested additional concessions, small ones at first, personal items, accounts he said were insignificant. He framed each request as a kindness, as if he were sparing me the burden of managing them. When I did not resist, his confidence grew. He started speaking to me with the gentle authority reserved for someone already defeated. The humiliations followed naturally. He corrected my version of events in front of others. He spoke about our future as if I were a footnote. He began referring to the house as his house, the finances as his responsibility, the life we had built as something I had merely inhabited. I watched people adjust their behavior accordingly, their sympathy shifting into pity. I allowed it. Every time someone told me I was being too passive, I nodded. Every time someone warned me I would regret this later, I thanked them. My calm unsettled people. It made them nervous. It made them lean in closer, as if they might catch me breaking if they waited long enough. My lawyer grew increasingly uneasy. He reminded me of my rights. He pointed out inconsistencies. He flagged numbers that did not sit right. When he pressed me, I told him I trusted the process. I told him I wanted peace. I told him I did not have the energy for war. He looked at me like a man watching someone walk into a storm without a coat. What none of them knew was that this storm was familiar to me. There had been a moment, long before any of this, when something I was not meant to see revealed itself. A quiet discovery tucked inside paperwork I had handled 1,000 times before. I did not react then. I did not confront or accuse or expose. I learned. I watched. I waited. Knowledge does not always demand action. Sometimes it demands timing. I never shared that discovery with anyone, not my husband, not my lawyer, not my closest friends. Secrets have weight, and I needed this one to stay exactly where it was, heavy and unseen. The less resistance I offered now, the more certain everyone became that I was finished. That certainty was useful. Each new document felt sharper than the last. Each request cut closer to the bone. I signed where it was expected. I asked for explanations in a voice just soft enough to sound unsure. I let my hand tremble once, deliberately, while holding a pen. I watched my husband relax in response, his posture loosening, his tone growing almost indulgent. He believed he was dismantling me piece by piece. In reality, he was assembling something for himself without checking the instructions. By the time the court date was scheduled, the narrative was set. I was the woman who could not fight anymore. He was the man who had prevailed. People stopped watching closely once they decided how the story ended. That is the danger of underestimation. It blinds you to movement. I walked toward what looked like ruin with my eyes open, step by careful step, because sometimes the safest place to stand is exactly where no one thinks you would choose to be, and I was right where I needed to be. Court day arrived with all the ceremony of a ritual everyone else seemed eager to rush through. The hallway smelled faintly of old paper and polished wood, and every footstep echoed louder than it should have. My husband walked beside me with an ease that felt rehearsed. His shoulders were relaxed, his expression light, like a man stepping into a meeting he already knew he would win. He nodded at people we recognized. He smiled at me once, brief and indulgent, the smile you give something you no longer need to think about. I returned it politely. Inside the courtroom, everything fell into place with mechanical precision. The judge took her seat. The clerk arranged the files. Lawyers shuffled papers and murmured to one another. This was not anyone's first time here, and that was exactly the point. The system runs smoothly when people behave as expected. My lawyer leaned toward me and whispered one last time that we could still pause. He told me we could request more time. He told me I did not have to do this. His voice carried an edge of urgency he had not been able to hide for weeks. I looked at him, nodded, and told him I was ready. He searched my face for something, anything, that would justify pulling me back from the edge. He did not find it. My husband's lawyer looked distracted, already flipping through his calendar, tapping his pen against the folder like he had other places to be. This case was clean in his mind, straightforward. A man keeping what was his, a woman stepping aside. There was no drama to prepare for. The documents were passed across the table, thick, orderly, final. Each one carried language that transferred ownership, responsibility, obligation, assets, property, accounts, interests. Everything my husband had demanded was there, spelled out in precise legal terms. I read each page slowly, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to. This was not surrender. This was confirmation. I signed, again and again. My pen moved steadily, my hand calm, my posture composed. I did not rush, and I did not hesitate. I could feel my lawyer tense beside me with every signature. I could sense his frustration, his disbelief. From his perspective, this was the moment where a reasonable person would stop. From mine, this was the moment everything locked into place. My husband watched with open satisfaction. He leaned back slightly in his chair, crossing his arms, his smile widening as each document slid back across the table. He had the look of someone watching a door close behind another person, confident they would never walk through it again. He did not look at the details. He did not need to. He believed the outcome had already been decided. I gave him exactly what he wanted, publicly, legally, irreversibly. The judge asked the required questions, her tone measured, her eyes attentive. Did I understand what I was agreeing to? Was I acting voluntarily? Had I consulted with counsel? I answered clearly and without emotion. Yes, yes, yes. I did not explain myself. I did not justify my choices. I simply confirmed them. For a moment, I wondered if she might stop us. Judges sometimes do when something feels off, but I was calm. I was represented. I was coherent. There was nothing for her to interrupt. The system moved forward because there was no visible reason not to. My husband signed next, faster than I had, his pen barely slowing as his name repeated itself across the pages. He glanced at me once more, his eyes bright with triumph, as if to say this was easier than he had expected. His confidence filled the room. It was contagious, until it wasn't. His lawyer reached the final packet and stopped, not abruptly, just enough to register. He flipped back a page, then forward again. His pen hovered above the paper without touching it. He leaned closer, scanning lines he had clearly skimmed before. The rhythm of the room shifted, subtle but unmistakable. I watched him carefully. The color drained from his face in stages, like a slow realization catching up to him. His jaw tightened, his fingers stilled. He did not look at my husband yet. He did not speak. He simply stared at the document in front of him, as if it had changed when he was not looking. Across the table, my husband was still smiling. The pause stretched, and no one said a word. The silence after that pause felt heavier than anything spoken before it. His lawyer finally cleared his throat, softly at first, as if unsure whether he was allowed to interrupt what my husband believed was his victory lap. He leaned toward his client and murmured something I could not hear, but I saw the shift immediately. My husband's smile faltered, not disappearing yet, just tightening at the edges as confusion crept in. "What is it?" he whispered back, irritation flickering across his face. His lawyer did not answer him right away. Instead, he straightened and addressed the judge, his voice measured but strained. He requested clarification regarding the scope of liabilities associated with the assets being transferred. The words sounded clinical, almost harmless, but the room felt different the moment they were spoken. Like a floorboard cracking under weight no one realized had been there. The judge looked down at the documents, then back up at him. She asked him to be specific. He swallowed and began to explain. The properties, the accounts, the business interests, each one carried obligations, mortgages, credit lines, outstanding balances, commitments tied to ownership that did not disappear simply because someone wanted them to. His voice grew tighter as he spoke, urgency creeping in despite his effort to remain composed. My husband leaned forward now, his chair scraping faintly against the floor. "What liabilities?" he asked, louder than necessary. "Those are assets." The judge turned her attention to him, her expression neutral but attentive. She asked whether he had reviewed the full financial disclosures attached to the agreement. He hesitated, then said of course he had. Confidence returned to his tone too quickly, like someone doubling down without checking their footing. I watched his certainty fracture in real time as the judge began to read. She referenced specific documents, loan agreements, financial statements, disclosures that had been signed and acknowledged. She asked if he recognized his signature. She asked if he understood that ownership included responsibility. Each question landed with quiet precision. There was no accusation in her voice, just process. He turned toward me then, disbelief giving way to anger. He accused me of hiding information, of manipulating paperwork, of setting him up. His words tumbled out faster with each sentence, desperation sharpening them into something almost frantic. For the first time that day, he looked afraid. I did not respond. The court did. His lawyer produced the waiver, the one that documented his refusal to conduct an independent financial review despite counsel's recommendation. The one he had signed without reading because he was in a hurry to be done. The judge reviewed it briefly, then set it down with a finality that made my chest feel strangely light. She explained patiently that disclosure had been made, that acknowledgement had been signed, that the court could not protect someone from agreements they entered knowingly, especially when advised otherwise. She reminded him that he had demanded full ownership, that I had relinquished all claims, that the transfer was exactly what he had asked for. Every attempt he made to object only reinforced the structure closing around him. Each argument led back to a signature. Each denial led back to a document. There was no dramatic reveal, no sudden twist, just the slow realization that the room was no longer on his side. I sat quietly, my hands folded in my lap, my breathing steady. This was not the moment to explain. It was the moment to let the truth stand on its own. The devastation did not arrive all at once. It unfolded gradually, expression by expression, as the weight of what he now owned settled into place. The judge asked one final time if there were any remaining objections. There were none that mattered. She delivered the ruling without flourish. The agreement stood as signed. The assets were his. The liabilities attached to them were his as well. The marriage was dissolved. The terms were final. The gavel came down. It was not loud, but it was absolute. My husband remained seated, staring at the table in front of him, as if the wood might offer a different outcome if he looked long enough. His lawyer leaned close again, this time speaking urgently, but the words no longer mattered. Whatever he was saying came too late. I stood when instructed, gathered my things, and felt a surprising calm settle over me. I did not look at my husband as I turned to leave. There was nothing left to say. He had kept everything he demanded, and everything had kept him. As I stepped out of the courtroom, the door closing softly behind me, I knew this part of the story was over. Not because he had been destroyed in some dramatic explosion, but because the truth had done what it always does when left alone long enough. It finishes the job. The collapse did not announce itself with headlines or sirens. It happened quietly, the way structural failures always do, starting with stress fractures no one wanted to admit were there. Within weeks, the calls began. Banks first, then partners, then people who had once laughed too loudly at his jokes. The assets he had insisted on keeping came with deadlines, interest, and obligations that did not care about confidence. The house was suddenly not a trophy, but a liability. The accounts were not symbols of success, but open wounds that bled steadily. People disappeared with impressive speed. Invitations stopped arriving. Friends who had once praised his drive stopped returning messages. The social circle adjusted its story without missing a beat. Where he had once been admired, he was now pitied. Where his certainty had been attractive, it was now embarrassing. Reputation is a fragile thing when it is built on appearances instead of substance. He tried to explain himself to anyone who would listen. He blamed timing. He blamed the market. He blamed misunderstandings. Eventually, he blamed me. That narrative traveled for a while, carried by those who preferred simple villains to complicated truths. But explanations lose power when paperwork exists. Facts have a way of outlasting charm. He reached out to me once, then twice. His messages were careful, almost polite, as if we were colleagues revisiting a misunderstanding. He wanted to talk. He wanted to clarify. He wanted to revisit the agreement. I did not respond. Silence was not punishment. It was boundaries. I had already said everything that mattered in a courtroom where it counted. Watching consequences unfold did not make me feel victorious. It made me feel finished. There is a difference. I did not need him to suffer to feel whole. I only needed the truth to be acknowledged by reality itself. That happened without my intervention. My life became smaller and steadier. I moved into a place that fit me instead of impressing others. I organized my days around my own rhythms. I slept better. I made decisions without explaining them. Stability arrived not as excitement, but as relief. Independence is quiet when it is real. People began to look at me differently too. The woman they had pitied was now regarded with something closer to respect, though few admitted it aloud. They asked how I stayed so calm. They asked how I knew when to stop fighting. I answered honestly when I answered at all. Calm is not the absence of feeling. It is the presence of control. He never recovered the way he expected to. There was no redemption arc waiting off stage, just a long adjustment to a life that no longer bent around him. That is not cruelty. That is consequence. The world does